When two polar bears suddenly show up at an abandoned house in a small remote village, the locals immediately call for help dealing with them, and scientist David Chishnall is the first on the scene. He is tasked with figuring out why these animals showed up at this house and now refuse to leave. It would end up taking a heroic effort to figure this out. It was no coincidence that these polar bears ended up here. Not at all. David's legs were shaking as he made his way through the abandoned house. It was pitch black almost, and the only light he had was the small torch on his phone. He knew that the two polar bears were still around here somewhere. He just hoped that they were asleep. As he was walking around, he did not notice anything out of the ordinary. Nothing that could have possibly attracted these two polar bears. But then, David made his way to the bedroom, and when he opened up the door, it all quickly became very clear to him. The two polar bears were laying soon asleep here, and in between them was what had attracted them to this house. David could have never expected to find this here. But how did these polar bears end up here? What had attracted them to the house, and why was David so adamant about finding out? The people from the small village had gotten the shock of their lives when the two polar bears had suddenly shown up. It was the first time that something like this happened to this small town. Nobody had seen where these bears had come from. The only thing that they knew was that the animals had found their way into one of the old abandoned houses. It was difficult approaching them. No one of the people that were living in this small village dared to approach the animals. The people living close by the house where the bears settled left to stay with their friends. Somebody had to get the animals out of here, but also needed to find out why they came in the first place. It was a big question for them, why the bears were in their small town. The only person who came was David. It was well known that the village was fairly difficult to reach. It would take special animal handlers, a couple of days at least, to get everything they needed to the location. But who was able to show up much sooner than everyone else was a scientist named David. He was a specialist in wild animals, so he could be really helpful in this kind of situation. When he first heard about these two polar bears being so far from their natural habitat, he was extremely curious about the reason for it. It was at least a 10-hour drive, but he couldn't miss this chance. He didn't hesitate a moment and left the very next morning. He wanted to save these bears and help them to go back to where they came from. On the way, he was making calls to colleagues and tried to set up a plan of approach. Even if he was all alone, he wanted to know the reason why these animals were there. He was worried that it was going to be really difficult, but as it would turn out, that would go relatively easy. He finally arrived. After a long trip, he finally arrived in the village. There was no doubt as to what house he needed to be at. The citizens had taken it upon themselves to set out caution tape around it, and it did not take long before David first saw the reason that he came all this way. He was excited about this because he thought that it would be an interesting case. The porch of the house and in front of the window, he saw them. There were two relatively small polar bears. He felt his heart skip a beat. It was the first time in his life that he had seen one of these magnificent creatures up close before. It could be the most beautiful time of professional career. David was very thrilled about this new adventure, on the fear after the excitement. After a couple of minutes, after all this excitement, also came some fear. He wanted nothing more than to get inside the house and figure out what had attracted these animals. But for that, he would need to get into the house. It was not the easiest thing to do because he didn't know how the bears would behave. First, he wanted to figure out something else. Where do they come from? He knew very well that the polar bears aren't native to this area of the world, so where did these two come from? He had already checked, and there were no zoos around the place, so they couldn't have escaped from there. He also checked if there were any listed private owners, but he found nothing. So it was a huge mystery for him the place that these bears came from. Talking to the locals, David found out that nobody had seen these bears arriving at the village. But many of the villagers did have their theories. It was really normal for them to come out with ideas and theories about the bears. Because it was the first time that something like this had happened to this small village, they needed an easy explanation. The villagers' theories. According to some of them, It was the first time that they had seen these animals around here. They claimed to have seen them from a distance in the forest when they were hiking or hunting. But nobody had been sure they were not just seeing things. So David was really lost among all these opinions, and he did not have a clue if one of them was telling the truth. They had seen them before. These sightings of the bears go back at least 10 years, but probably only tally up to about 8 years. Nobody had discussed them before, as they were afraid people would think they had gone crazy, because seeing polar bears around was nearly impossible. The most possible scenario was that these bears had been surviving around here for a while. David was still unsure about how they could have gotten here in the first place. He suspected that would have been some human involvement, but he didn't know exactly how humans could affect these two polar bears. This house was abandoned for years, so if these bears were here for a long period, what had attracted them to this old house now? People of the village told him that the house had been this way for years. No one lived in this house for as long as they could remember, but for sure it was not strange at all that the bears chose a house without people because they wanted to feel safe. The restoration was really expensive. The house was in such a bad situation that nobody had any interest in taking the restoration upon themselves. It would most likely cost a lot more money than it would ever bring in. So for many years, nobody was living in this old house. All of these findings and stories David heard were only getting him more curious about what could possibly be inside this old and empty house. So after some days of thinking and talking, David and some locals came up with a brilliant new plan. It was his only chance to find out what happened to this old house and why the bears chose the place. How could he enter the house? Their best chance of entering the place was when the animals were both asleep. But they needed a way to almost guarantee this before this would even be possible to try. In the case that these bears were not asleep, this would be a serious problem for them. They wanted to protect themselves because even if these polar bears were small, it doesn't mean that they were not wild animals. Villagers were all around the house. So the villagers would end up taking turns staying near the house and making a lot of noise to keep the bears away from sleeping at all. They wanted to exhaust the animals so they would fall asleep more easily and deeply. However, this did come with some potentially dangerous consequences for their physical integrity. The polar bears were starting to get angrier, and there was a good chance they could hit out at the people that were making all the noise. But luckily, they had come up with some safety measures. It was a very difficult plan, and they wanted to prepare themselves for every occasion. The person near the house was not alone, so they had decided that the person who was near the house and was making all the noise would never be alone. They came up with the idea that close to him there would always be someone or a car ready to pick him up and save him. In case the polar bears came out, ready to attack him, the person could be quickly taken to safety. This had never happened. But luckily, and strangely, this never happened. Even if the polar bears seemed really angry with those people and the noise, they still refused to leave the house. This also made it clear to David that going into the house with them still present was his only option. He knew that this would be really difficult and dangerous, but he risked it all. When David finally made his way into the house and the bedroom where the polar bears were sleeping, he found out that one of them had actually given birth to cubs here, and most likely did not want to leave the house as they wanted to protect the babies. In the end, Animal Rescue Services managed to get all the polar bears out and transported them to a big zoo where they could see out the rest of their days fairly comfortably. The house is still abandoned and probably will be until it is eventually reclaimed by nature.